The morning of March 5th, 1944, dawned pale and brittle over the rolling fields near Monte Cassino. The Allied advance in Italy had stalled, the air thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid tang of spent cordite. Lieutenant Samuel Hargrove, a tank commander with the 3rd Armoured Division, hunched inside his M-four Sherman, peering through the vision slit. Frost clung to the periscope lenses, and every vibration of the engine seemed to echo through his teeth. His crew, 5 men hardened by months of Italy's harsh winter campaigns, were quiet, each absorbed in routine checks, hands moving over gauges, ammunition racks, and the welded seams that held their 30-ton fortress together. Hargrove's stomach tightened as he remembered the reports. Units lost, tanks that had burned from a single hit, crews trapped inside the blazing hull. They called the Sherman a Ronson Lighter, a dark joke whispered in mess halls and scribbled into letters home: lights, first time, every time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The phrase had originated from the far deserts of North Africa, where German Panzer crews had discovered the Sherman's weakness. Against the 88mm pack guns of the Afrika Korps, the tank's armour was unreliable, but it wasn't just the thickness that betrayed them, it was the seams. The design called for speed of production over resilience. Standardized butt welds joined the plates of the hull edge to edge, leaving a 1/4 inch of unfused metal at the root, a flaw invisible to X-ray inspection but deadly when impacted by a high-velocity projectile. In the field, a single 88 could strike the side or belly, and the weld would give way before the plate, allowing molten metal and fire to erupt inside. By the summer of 1943, replacements arriving in Normandy already knew the grim reputation of the Sherman. They knew to expect fire, and they knew to pray they could bail out before the metal coffin became a furnace. Yet, in the spring of 1944, something was changing. Reports filtered up from workshops and depots. New tanks were arriving with a system called wet stowage. The term was deceptively simple: ammunition racks lined with water jackets to prevent cook-off fires, but its effect was profound. Crews who had lived through nightmares of armoured hell began to survive hits that would have been fatal only months earlier. Lieutenant Hargrove's division was one of the first to receive the wet stowage Shermans. As the column rumbled forward, he ran his hand along the interior of the hull, tracing the familiar seams. There was a new confidence among his men. Sergeant James "Red" Callahan, who had watched 2 of his best friends die in North Africa when their tank erupted under fire, muttered almost reverently, "Maybe she won't light up this time." Hargrove allowed himself a tight smile. The irony was striking. The Germans, who had so confidently nicknamed the Sherman after a cigarette lighter, were about to confront a machine that refused to burn, at least not in the way they expected. To understand the depth of that irony, one must look at the foundation of American armoured doctrine and production philosophy. By 1942, the United States had committed to mass-producing the Sherman in unprecedented numbers, over 50,000 tanks between 1942 and 1945. Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago churned them out like clockwork. The design prioritized reliability, ease of maintenance, and standardized parts, a philosophy born from lessons learned in mechanized warfare's early, brutal experiments. Engineers understood that no tank was invulnerable, but a broken-down tank was useless. Speed of replacement was considered a tactical advantage, almost a form of attrition warfare. Yet, German gunners had exploited a flaw that the engineers had barely considered. The Sherman's thin armour, combined with those standard welds, was enough to make them laugh, or at least, to label them with grim humour. In the field, Panzer crews noted the behaviour of the Sherman under fire. A direct hit on the hull, side, or sponson often caused the ammunition racks to ignite, consuming the interior in seconds. The human response crew panic, hasty escape, loss of tank amplified the material weakness. Field manuals listed armour thickness and firing tables, but the lived reality of fire, heat, and smoke was another matter entirely. In response, the Army Ordnance Department began experiments in wet stowage. Ammunition racks, the source of catastrophic cook-offs, were encased in thin water jackets. Each round sat in a small cavity surrounded by water, drastically slowing the ignition of propellant and fragments when penetrated. Field trials indicated reductions in tank fires of 85%. For the first time, the Sherman was not just a rolling coffin in the eyes of its crews, it became survivable. Lieutenant Hargrove would witness this transformation firsthand. On March 7, 1944, his company advanced near Monte Cassino under German artillery harassment. A Panzer tank emerged from a tree line, 88mm gun trained on his lead Sherman. The shell struck the side hull at a near-optimal angle for penetration. Hargrove's heart stopped. Smoke erupted outside the vision slit, but inside, the crew remained remarkably composed. The wet stowage racks prevented the ammunition from cooking off. The tank burned, yes, but in a slow, controllable fashion. Hargrove fired the main gun, maneuvered, and ultimately survived the engagement with all 5 crewmen intact. It was a subtle, almost clinical, moment of revelation. The Sherman had been written off as a fragile, combustible machine, yet here it survived under the precise conditions that had killed countless men before. The nickname Ronson Lighter no longer captured the truth. It was now a relic of memory, a label that German aces would find increasingly inaccurate as the Allies advanced through Italy and into France. This moment, an engineering adaptation coupled with lived human experience, crystallized the broader psychological shift in armored warfare. Crews began to trust their tanks in ways previously unimaginable. Tactics adjusted. Commanders could plan advances without the implicit assumption that every tank might become an inferno at first contact. The irony, profound and quiet, was that an innovation seemingly minor, the addition of water around ammunition, could redefine the survivability of thousands of men, altering the pace and outcome of operations in subtle but critical ways. To truly appreciate the full depth of this transformation, one must consider the material and human realities of the Sherman's early reputation. North Africa, 1942, and Tunisia, 1943, provide the starkest contrast. Crews described the side plates as brittle, the sponson mounts as lethal traps, the belly as a vulnerable seam waiting for a Panzer shell to ignite hell. Letters home from tankers were suffused with grim humour and despair. Ronson, Tommy Cooker, crematorium on tracks. In every theatre the lesson was clear: survive the first hit, and pray it doesn't come from the wrong angle. Wet stowage, by contrast, was a methodical, almost antiseptic solution to a chaotic problem. It acknowledged the psychological trauma of constant threat, the material flaws of the tank, and the lethal ingenuity of the enemy. By encasing the propellant in water, engineers transformed the Sherman's internal vulnerability into a manageable risk. The lesson extended beyond metallurgy and hydrodynamics. It reached the very core of soldier confidence, morale, and the strategic calculus of armoured warfare. Hargrove, writing in his diary that night, captured this evolution in a single, understated line. "She didn't burn today, and neither did we. Maybe the stories were wrong, or maybe we were just lucky. But she held." The day-to-day of armoured combat, long marches, breakdowns, skirmishes with infantry and artillery remained harrowing. The Germans were adept at ambush, flanking, and targeting weak points. But now, for the first time, Sherman crews had a measure of agency. They could survive, return fire, and even counterattack without the immediate spectre of fiery death lurking in the hull. Wet stowage did not make them invulnerable, but it made them reliable in a psychological and material sense, reshaping both perception and reality. By 1944's summer campaigns in Normandy and later in the Ardennes, the impact of wet stowage was clear. Tank losses due to internal fires plummeted. German crews were forced to reconsider their assumptions about the Sherman, realizing that a gun that had reliably set American tanks ablaze might now produce a slower, less lethal result. The once feared Ronson was no longer just a lighter. It had become, in practice, a resilient fighting vehicle, capable of supporting the infantry, holding objectives, and surviving encounters that would have been fatal months earlier. By late March 1944, the 3rd Armoured Division had begun to internalize the lessons of wet stowage Shermans. Training exercises shifted from simply maneuvering and firing to fully integrating the new racks into crew routines. Tankers learned not just to operate the machine, but to trust it. Lieutenant Hargrove's company spent hours on mock engagements, tracking simulated hits to see how the water-jacketed ammunition behaved under stress. Reports indicated that even under multiple penetrations, less than 1 in 8 tanks experienced catastrophic internal fires, a staggering improvement over prior attrition rates. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. Crews who had once climbed out of burning Shermans, scorched and traumatized, now watched as shells struck and sparks flared without consuming the interior. Sergeant Callahan remarked to a new recruit, "You'll get used to it. Fire isn't instant death anymore. That's the miracle of water, of careful thinking." His tone was half teaching, half marveling. For the first time, the men could plan maneuvers with the expectation that their tank would remain functional, that ammunition might survive a hit, and that survival was probable rather than miraculous. This change had immediate tactical consequences. Commanders began adjusting armored doctrine to exploit the Sherman's new reliability. Previously, U.S. tank tactics had relied heavily on combined arms approaches, keeping infantry and artillery tightly interwoven with armor to reduce exposure to German anti-tank weapons. The Sherman's vulnerability to 88mm guns had made independent armored thrusts suicidal. Wet stowage altered this balance. Crews could now operate with a degree of autonomy, confident that the machine could absorb 1 or 2 hits without immediate loss of combat capability. During the Allied push toward Monte Cassino in late March, Hargrove's company participated in an engagement that crystallized this tactical transformation. German defenders had entrenched a Panther platoon along a ridge overlooking the advance. The commanding officer ordered Hargrove to lead a flanking maneuver through a narrow valley. The Sherman column moved under intermittent artillery and small arms fire, the ground trembling beneath the rolling weight of 30 tons of steel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A Panther emerged from cover and fired. The 88mm shell struck the side of Hargrove's lead tank at nearly a right angle. In prior months, such a hit would have ignited the ammunition, killing the crew outright. Instead, smoke curled from the impact site. The metal groaned, and sparks flickered along the water-jacketed racks, but the rounds did not cook off. Hargrove's crew remained calm, continuing to fire the main gun and machine guns while maneuvering. Within minutes, they had destroyed 2 Panther positions and advanced the line. The effectiveness of wet stowage had turned a potentially fatal encounter into a tactical advantage. The material specifics of the system were deceptively simple. Each ammunition rack consisted of a shallow steel trough filled with water, into which individual rounds were carefully slotted. The water absorbed heat from a penetrating shell, preventing the propellant from reaching ignition temperature. Designers calculated that a 35-pound round could be completely surrounded by water without exceeding operational weight limits or compromising the tank's balance. The racks were modular, allowing for quick replacement in field workshops, and could be adapted to different Sherman models, from the M-four Ione to the A3 variant. It was an engineering solution born of accumulated wartime experience. Lessons learned from North Africa and Italy had highlighted not only the Sherman's vulnerabilities, but also the broader principle that survivability depended as much on preventing internal failures as on resisting external penetration. The U.S. Army Ordnance Corps, in coordination with Chrysler and Ford tank arsenals, had run extensive field trials. Engineers fired captured German 88mm rounds, Panzer granate 39 and 41, at wet stowage test tanks under controlled conditions. Results consistently demonstrated an 85% reduction in internal fires, enough to shift doctrinal planning and crew confidence dramatically. The transformation extended beyond the engineering. Letters from crews began to reflect a renewed sense of agency and morale. One tanker, Corporal James McKnight of the 7th Armoured, wrote in May 1944, "I saw a Panther hit our side today. Sparks flew, and I expected the worst. But nothing exploded. We kept moving. We kept shooting. I think the Sherman finally deserves its reputation not as a rolling coffin, but as a machine that lets you fight another day." These accounts were echoed across multiple divisions. Commanders noted fewer crew casualties, more operational tanks per engagement, and improved coordination with infantry units. The wet stowage Shermans had not made the vehicle invulnerable, but they had transformed its predictability, which in warfare is nearly as valuable as armor thickness. The Germans, in turn, began to notice. Tank aces and artillery units that had once relished the ease of igniting Shermans in North Africa were confronted with tanks that survived hits that would previously have been fatal. Field reports from German units in Italy and later in France referenced the diminished effectiveness of standard anti-tank tactics against wet stowage Shermans. One veteran Panzer officer recounted after the war, "We expected fire. It had always happened." But by 1944, the American tanks sometimes survived what should have been certain destruction. It was disconcerting. Our 88s did not produce the same results. This observation highlights the profound irony of the situation. The Sherman's earlier failures had earned it infamy, but the correction, a relatively simple adjustment to ammunition stowage, redefined its performance and forced the enemy to recalibrate expectations. The psychological element was as important as the material one. A German crew firing upon a wet stowage Sherman no longer had certainty of victory. They faced ambiguity in the outcome of each hit. In warfare, uncertainty erodes confidence, and confidence is a force multiplier as real as any tank or gun. By the time the Allies reached Normandy in June 1944, wet stowage Shermans were in wider circulation. The timing was critical. D-Day landings and subsequent operations exposed tanks to intense fire, including from concealed Panzer units equipped with high-velocity guns. Crews reported survival from direct hits that would previously have resulted in fatal internal fires. The perception of vulnerability, which had dominated Allied armoured tactics, began to shift toward a recognition that Shermans could be relied upon, not just in numbers, but in survivability. The human dimension remained central. Crews, trained in evacuation procedures and fire drills, adapted their behavior to maximize the benefit of wet stowage. When a shell struck, the focus shifted from instinctive panic to calculated response. Continue firing, assess damage, and maintain maneuvering. Survival rates improved dramatically, reinforcing the psychological impact. Tank commanders like Hargrove observed that men operated with greater precision, less hesitation, and a willingness to engage the enemy aggressively, a stark contrast to the fear-driven caution that had characterized earlier campaigns. The cumulative effect of wet stowage extended beyond individual encounters. Operational planning could now incorporate Shermans as semi-independent units capable of sustained advances under fire. Supply logistics were recalibrated, knowing that fewer tanks would be lost to internal fires, reducing the replacement burden. Infantry units could rely on armoured support with greater confidence, facilitating combined arms operations that were previously constrained by the Sherman's fragility. In the Ardennes, during the bitter fighting of December 1944, wet stowage Shermans proved invaluable. Despite harsh winter conditions, the reduction in tank fires meant crews could maintain operational tempo under extreme stress. Engagements with German Panzers demonstrated that while the 88mm gun remained lethal, the tactical disadvantage imposed by instant internal fires had largely been mitigated. Crews could fight, maneuver, and survive in a manner unthinkable in prior campaigns. Reflecting on the evolution of the Sherman, one sees a layered interplay of engineering, human experience, and psychological adaptation. The nickname Ronson Lighter, once a term of derision, became a historical footnote, a reminder of early vulnerability, rather than a description of the tank's ultimate effectiveness. Wet stowage did not make the Sherman invulnerable, nor did it eliminate losses. What it achieved was the crucial conversion of inevitability into possibility, of despair into operational confidence, and of panic into calculated action. Lieutenant Hargrove, in a post-war interview, captured the essence of this transformation. We all knew the stories, how the tanks caught fire and crews didn't make it. But with the wet stowage models, it was different. You could hit, move, and survive. That little bit of engineering water around the ammo, it saved lives and gave us the courage to fight differently. It didn't make the Sherman invincible, but it made it trustworthy. The legacy of wet stowage extended into post-war tank design. American and British engineers incorporated lessons learned about ammunition safety, internal fire suppression, and crew survivability into subsequent armoured vehicles. The principle was simple yet profound. Survivability is not merely a function of armour, thickness, or gun calibre, but of intelligent mitigation of internal hazards and understanding of human psychology under fire. In the grand tapestry of World War II, the story of the Sherman's transformation underscores the often overlooked impact of small, precise innovations. While battles were decided by numbers, strategy, and firepower, the survival of men inside 30-ton steel boxes hinged on technical adjustments that, to the untrained eye, might seem minor. Wet stowage was one such innovation, an unglamorous, quiet improvement that altered the psychological landscape of armoured warfare. By 1945, as Allied forces advanced across Western Europe, the Sherman's reputation had shifted. German crews no longer anticipated instant fiery destruction upon contact. American crews fought with newfound confidence. Commanders planned with tanks that could endure hits they previously could not. The Sherman, once mocked as a Ronson Lighter, had evolved into a machine that combined industrial mass production with human-centered design improvements, creating a fighting vehicle whose greatest victories were as much psychological as they were material. Ultimately, the Sherman's story, its vulnerabilities, adaptations, and transformations, reminds us that in warfare, small details often carry enormous weight. A single inch of water around ammunition changed outcomes, saved lives, and altered the perception of an entire class of fighting vehicles. It is a lesson in how ingenuity, careful observation, and attention to human experience can redefine a machine's place in history, turning what was once a symbol of fear into one of resilience. By the spring of 1945, the European theatre of war had entered its final, relentless stages. American armoured divisions advanced across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, and the Sherman, once derided as a fragile Ronson Lighter, had proven remarkably resilient. The wet stowage innovation, though technically simple, had fundamentally shifted both Allied confidence and German expectations. Tanks that once seemed expendable had become reliable tools of manoeuvre, their crews emboldened to engage decisively rather than survive in cautious, piecemeal strikes. The human dimension remained at the forefront of this transformation. Lieutenant Hargrove, now a company commander, reflected on the change in his men. New recruits arrived fresh from training camps, initially nervous about the Sherman's reputation. Older crewmen, survivors of North Africa and Italy, offered guidance rooted in experience and reinforced by evidence. Sergeant Callahan, once traumatized by the fiery deaths of his friends, now drilled the newcomers in wet stowage survival protocols. "This isn't magic," he told them, voice low but firm. "It's engineering you can trust. Know your racks, know your tank, and trust it. That water around the rounds gives you a chance we never had before." The emphasis on training and psychological adaptation was deliberate. Ordnance engineers recognized that survivability depended not only on materials but on how crews reacted to crises. A tank hit in the hull or side was no longer an automatic death sentence. Crews could observe, react, and continue. fighting, and this knowledge became a form of tactical leverage. Confidence itself, carefully nurtured, became a weapon. Operational reports from Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Rhineland consistently reflected the impact of wet stowage Shermans. Analysts recorded that tanks equipped with water-jacketed ammunition racks were far less likely to suffer catastrophic internal fires, even under direct hits from high-velocity German guns. Losses were reduced, crew survival increased, and tactical flexibility expanded. In turn, this allowed armoured commanders to pursue more aggressive manoeuvres, concentrating armour in ways previously considered unacceptably risky. The irony of the Sherman's transformation was not lost on the soldiers themselves. Units that had suffered immense casualties from internal fires now advanced with a renewed sense of purpose. Crews who had once whispered grim nicknames now spoke openly of trust in their vehicles, often with quiet pride. In letters, home, a recurring motif appeared. Men celebrated survival not merely as luck, but as the tangible result of careful engineering and adaptation. Private First Class Thomas Gallagher, writing from Belgium in December 1944, described the effect succinctly. "We were hit today. Normally, that would have been it. The Sherman would have burned, and we'd be gone. But the ammo didn't go off. We climbed out, all of us, and kept moving. It feels strange, almost like fighting with a shield instead of a coffin." This sense of agency carried over into battlefield tactics. Units no longer hesitated to press armoured assaults under artillery fire or to maintain forward positions despite the presence of Panzer units. The reduction in internal fire risk enabled crews to operate closer to the front lines with confidence, applying concentrated firepower to German defences. The Sherman, a vehicle mass-produced for speed and quantity rather than individual invincibility, had evolved into a psychologically dependable instrument of war. The German perspective underscores the magnitude of this change. Panzer crews, once confident that a direct hit would ignite American tanks, encountered a disorienting shift. Fire, previously instantaneous, became delayed, localized, or entirely absent. Field notes from the Wehrmacht describe engagements where multiple 88mm rounds struck Shermans, yet the tanks continued to maneuver and return fire. Confidence eroded. The psychological certainty that had guided German anti-tank doctrine now became a source of hesitation and recalibration. One post-war account from a veteran Panzer officer reflected on the experience. "We knew the Shermans would burn. It had always been so. But by late 1944, that was no longer guaranteed. It was frustrating, almost insulting. We trained, planned, and fired with precision, and still, they sometimes survived. It forced us to rethink everything: our expectations, our strategy, our assumptions about American engineering." Wet stowage Shermans allowed Allied armoured formations to concentrate and sustain operations with greater efficiency. Supply lines, previously burdened by catastrophic losses and emergency replacements, were freed for more ambitious campaigns. The shift in survivability affected morale across units and encouraged coordinated advances that leveraged both armoured and infantry capabilities. In effect, a small engineering solution had ripple effects on operational doctrine, combat psychology, and strategic planning. Lieutenant Hargrove reflected on the irony in letters to his family. "We spent months thinking of the Sherman as a trap, a rolling coffin. Now, she gives us the chance to fight without that fear. One simple change water around the ammo, and everything else seems to follow. It's almost funny how much difference a little water can make." This observation highlights a critical historical lesson. The intersection of material innovation and human psychology can reshape the course of combat. In many ways, wet stowage represents an often overlooked pivot point in armoured warfare. While strategy, numbers, and firepower remained decisive, the ability to survive a hit changed the calculation of risk and opportunity for countless crews. The Sherman story, therefore, is not simply a tale of engineering. It is a study of adaptation, courage, and the subtleties of human trust in machines. By the war's end in May 1945, the Shermans' legacy was firmly established. Approximately 50,000 tanks had rolled off American assembly lines, each potentially carrying the wet stowage innovation that protected hundreds of crews. The nickname Ronson Lighter, once synonymous with inevitable death, became an artifact of the past. Veterans often recounted the evolution with a mixture of humor and reverence. The Sherman had been feared for its fragility, yet survived due to precise adjustments and disciplined use. The broader implications extended beyond World War II. Post-war tank designs, including the M-26 Pershing and subsequent American and British armoured vehicles, incorporated lessons from wet stowage experiments. Designers recognized the necessity of internal fire suppression, modular ammunition storage, and crew-centered survivability. These principles became central to armored doctrine, influencing decisions from the Korean War through to modern mechanized warfare. Equally important was the human dimension. Wet stowage did not merely preserve tanks, it preserved the men inside them, who went on to carry their experience, confidence, and understanding of armored combat into new conflicts and civilian life. Surviving a Sherman engagement with water-jacketed ammunition reinforced a broader lesson about preparation, adaptation, and the subtle power of incremental improvements in technology. In post-war memoirs, Sherman veterans consistently emphasized the psychological transformation as much as the technical. Lieutenant Hargrove noted, "It wasn't just that the tank survived, it was that we did too. And knowing that gave you the courage to move, to fight, to keep going where before you might have frozen. That little water jacket changed everything, our tactics, our thinking, and our very lives." The Sherman's evolution also provides a historical lens for understanding how small interventions can produce outsized effects in warfare. While grand strategy, operational planning, and sheer numbers often dominate historical accounts, the lived experience of soldiers and the incremental adjustments to machines can reshape outcomes in ways that are subtle but profound. The wet stowage system exemplifies this principle, illustrating how engineering solutions that address human vulnerability can ripple outward into tactical, operational, and strategic domains. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of Germany, the impact of wet stowage Shermans was visible in countless small but decisive ways. Crews operated with greater assurance, maintained fire under threat, and survived encounters that would have been fatal in earlier campaigns. German crews, previously confident in the Sherman's combustibility, confronted an unexpected reality. The nickname that had once inspired fear, Ronson Lighter, now represented a historical footnote, a reminder of a vulnerability that had been carefully, deliberately corrected. Reflecting on the Sherman's journey from fragile to survivable, one sees a narrative of resilience, ingenuity, and human adaptation. The tank's transformation encapsulates the interplay of engineering, psychological confidence, and battlefield necessity. It underscores the profound lesson that in war, even seemingly minor innovations, a water jacket around ammunition can reshape the human experience, tactical calculations, and ultimately the course of operations. In the quiet evenings after battles, crews would clean their tanks, inspect the wet stowage racks, and check welds, rituals once driven by fear now imbued with cautious confidence. They understood that survival was never guaranteed, but it was no longer improbable. The Sherman had become a vessel of endurance, a testament to the integration of material science and human-centered design. And so, in the final months of 1945, as Europe lay scarred but liberated, the Sherman story reached its ironic and instructive conclusion. German Panzer aces, once delighted at the ease of igniting American tanks, now faced machines that endured, crews that adapted, and a lesson that transcended steel and fire. Survival in war is a product not just of numbers or weaponry, but of careful thought, innovation, and the courage to trust both man and machine. The legacy endures. Historians, engineers, and veterans alike continue to study the Sherman not for its initial flaws, but for its transformation, a transformation defined by insight, adaptation, and the quiet heroism of those who survived to witness it. The Ronson Lighter may have sparked fear once, but in the end, it became a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the human capacity to turn vulnerability into strength. The final months of 1945 offered a reflective calm amid the devastation of Europe. Cities lay in ruins, roads and railways had been torn apart, and yet, amid the rubble, the Sherman tanks continued to roll. For many Allied tankers, the war's end was not marked by celebration alone, but by a quiet acknowledgement of survival made possible by small but decisive innovations like wet stowage ammunition. Lieutenant Hargrove, walking through a quiet German village now liberated, paused beside a Sherman whose paint had faded under months of sun, mud and snow. The water-jacketed ammunition racks had done their job countless times. He traced the welds along the turret, thinking back to the anxious days in Italy and the Ardennes, when every hit could have meant death. In those moments, the Sherman had been a fragile companion, a vehicle as likely to betray its crew as to protect them. Now, after the innovation of wet stowage, it had become something more, a trusted partner in combat, capable of giving men a chance to live, to fight another day, to hope. The human stories intertwined with this mechanical evolution. Crew members who had survived catastrophic hits in earlier campaigns now carried forward the knowledge that careful engineering and disciplined practice could save lives. Sergeant Callahan, who had once watched friends perish in burning tanks, often spoke to younger recruits not with horror, but with instruction and reassurance. "Trust the tank, trust the racks, and trust each other," he said repeatedly. Those words were both practical advice and a psychological balm, replacing fear with confidence. Even German veterans, after the war, reflected on the transformation with a mix of disbelief and respect. Panzer crews, accustomed to striking fear into American tankers with 88mm rounds, found that their assumptions were no longer reliable. A Sherman could survive what had once been certain death. The psychological advantage they once held dissipated. A weapon that had inspired dread had, through human ingenuity and engineering, been rendered far less predictable. This quiet victory, the reduction of internal fires by 85%, demonstrates how seemingly minor innovations can have monumental consequences. Wet stowage did not make the Sherman invincible. It did not grant armor comparable to the Panther or Tiger, nor did it render every engagement safe. But it introduced certainty where there had been none, a profound shift in the lives of men who climbed into 30-ton machines under enemy fire. Survival rates improved, morale strengthened, and tactical flexibility expanded. In the calculus of war, these were outcomes as decisive as any tank gun. By the time Allied forces pushed deep into the heart of Germany, wet stowage Shermans were standard, and their crews had internalized the lessons of confidence and caution. The tanks continued to be mass-produced, rolling off assembly lines with the assurance that the lessons of North Africa, Italy, and Normandy had been integrated into every weld, every rack, and every procedural drill. The Shermans were no longer just machines of war. They were vessels of adaptation, carrying both men and history forward. The broader implications of this innovation would resonate far beyond World War II. Post-war armored vehicles incorporated the principle of crew-centered survivability, learning from the Sherman's evolution. Lessons in internal fire prevention, modular ammunition stowage, and water jacket protection became standard considerations in design. Modern tank doctrine, whether American, British, or elsewhere, owes a debt to the quiet ingenuity that transformed the Sherman from a Ronson Lighter into a tank that could survive, endure, and give men a chance to rewrite the course of their battles. Reflecting on the Sherman's journey, one sees a layered narrative of human ingenuity, the intersection of psychology and engineering, and the resilience of men and machines under fire. It reminds us that war is not decided solely by strategy, numbers, or brute force. Often, the smallest interventions, a water jacket around ammunition, a carefully trained crew, a welder's insistence on doing the job correctly can have outsized consequences. Lives are saved, tactics change, and the momentum of history shifts in subtle but profound ways. In letters written home, veterans captured this transformation in understated tones. Private James McKnight wrote, months after surviving another engagement, "The Sherman still takes, hits, still shudders and groans under fire. But now we climb out of the tank knowing we might make it. That water around the ammo, it's saved us more times than I can count. It's strange how such a small thing changes everything." That small thing, the wet stowage system, became more than a technical innovation. It symbolized foresight, care for human life, and the quiet triumph of adaptation over fear. In the annals of World War II, it may not receive the same attention as the Normandy landings or the Battle of the Bulge, but for the men inside the Sherman, it was decisive. Survival was no longer a lottery. It was a function of engineering, discipline, and courage. As the war drew to a close, the Sherman's journey from the ridiculed Ronson Lighter to a symbol of endurance offered a profound historical irony. German Panzer crews, confident in their ability to ignite American tanks at will, had been forced to adjust expectations. Allied crews, once terrified of the firestorm inside their own vehicles, now fought with calm determination. And the engineers and welders who had quietly made this transformation possible remained largely unsung, their work hidden in the seams of steel, yet vital to the survival of thousands. In the end, the Sherman teaches a timeless lesson about warfare and human innovation, that survival and effectiveness are not only determined by size, firepower, or strategy, but by attention to detail, adaptation to prior failures, and the courage to implement incremental improvements. The wet stowage system, modest in concept but monumental in effect, exemplifies how even the smallest interventions can reshape the course of conflict, protect lives, and redefine reputation. When historians look back, the Sherman story is remembered not for the fire it once ignited, but for the lives it saved and the psychological transformation it enabled. It is a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet human determination to endure. The Ronson Lighter became a vessel of hope, proving that with thoughtful design and careful attention, even the most vulnerable machines and the men who operate them can survive the crucible of war. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.